It was really eye-opening for me. Like when I had my strokes, people wanted to know why. Like, why did it happen? And the thing is sometimes there isn't a why.
Thank you so much for being with me here on Winning Wednesday. It's always great to have B-teamers join me on the show. So I always like to open these up with a personal, professional check-in and give you a chance to share something that the audience might not know about you.
Not a lot of people know that I have multiple degrees in music, theater, and opera. In fact, I worked professionally as an opera singer and in musical theater for several years before I started at Verizon, and then also a couple of years into the start of my career. I really felt like it set me up for success at Verizon, and I don't think people intuitively would think that, but being somebody who's been in music and theater will teach you how to deal with rejection. It teaches you how to be resilient, how to be flexible.
Flexibility, I think, is huge. What was it about music that actually taught you that flexibility?
Needing to adapt to the idea that you're never going to hit stasis. You know, if you want to be a good artist, you're always learning, you're always growing.
Yeah, and you touched on kind of this passion I think a lot of people have for constantly learning and developing themselves. And I know not everyone may see the value in that or approach a work environment in the same way. And I think the employee resource groups are a really good example of cultivating those like-minded individuals who are really trying to develop themselves. And what value do you see on your end in prioritizing that as an organization?
You know, the topics that the ERGs deal with, they're not topics where you ever just hit this point and you're like, okay, great. We've got all the diversity we need. We've got it all. It's the way that culture shifts, I think, there's always going to be relevance for ERGs because, you know, as culture learns to embrace new things, then a whole new crop of other things come up, right? So there's always going to be a place for ERGs in broadening people's mindsets, opening people's minds to viewpoints, experiences, things that aren't necessarily common. It's nice to have a sense of community and belonging to things that aren't just professional, right? I think the ERGs do a good job of sort of blending topics where, yeah, the topics are about your career, but it's also just about things that you might care about, whether that's disability advocacy or what, just finding a community of like-minded people that gives you a sense of hey, you know, my job does mean something. My job, you know, is valuable. And there are people here who share my perspectives and are like-minded, you know, the way that I am for these topics.
And when it comes to the ERGs at Verizon, can you go into a little bit of detail about your volunteerism and what experience you've had there?
WAVE was the first ERG that I ever joined. That kind of opened my mind to what the ERGs are. I didn't really consider getting into some type of leadership role until I myself got very sick. And after I returned to work, some of the things that I was experiencing, some of the attitudes that not just people around me had, but that I personally had held prior to being sick about oh, you know, just kind of the common attitudes people have about illness that are they really that sick? You know, why can't they just suck it up? You know, yeah. I held a lot of those attitudes. And then, you know, when I got seriously sick and attempted that transition back into work, I was like, wow, there's a lot of work to be done here in terms of getting people to understand, you know, what remains to be done in the disability world, but also just the way that attitudes need to shift, particularly because disability, mental health issues, neurodivergences are so common. Mental health issues, depression, anxiety, OCD, dyslexia. When you start thinking of it through that lens, you realize how common it is. And if you accept that it's super common, then you start to question, why does society have the attitudes that it has?
I would say even just personally as an employee and a colleague, watching you from afar has been motivating for me, because when we hear disability, we tend to think of one type of disability. And that's usually based on our past experience of seeing people who are disabled in any capacity. And at least for me, I always think, oh, well, you were born that way and you're that way your whole life. There's not that element of, no, this could happen to you at any point in life.
Talking about it helps me find community. Talking about it also helps me to confront my own internalized attitudes about illness. And it was really eye-opening for me. Like when I had my strokes, people wanted to know why. Like, why did it happen? And the thing is sometimes there isn't a why. I think it's because if we can tell ourselves, oh, she had a stroke because she smoked, or oh, she had a stroke because, she ate too much or didn't exercise, or oh, she had a stroke because she was doing yoga, which I got a lot. Like, then you can comfort yourself that, oh, that won't happen to me, because see, that was that cause. But it's really hard to confront this idea that sometimes people just get sick. The positive that has come out of the pandemic is that people are starting to recognize how common depression is, how common anxiety is, because we've all just been sitting here sort of being forced to confront what we are and how we feel and how we think and the voices in our heads. Like, we're all kind of dealing with this, and people are to a place where I think they're desperate to talk about it. They're desperate to find community. And I think when I look at the activities that are happening in Mental Health Awareness Month, it's just been super to have so many different teams and people reaching out saying, hey, our team wants to talk about this. Hey, I'm a leader and I really want to make sure that I'm taking care of my team. What resources can we share about this topic? That was not happening, 2 years ago, and it's happening now. And I think it's super encouraging.
And what are some examples that employers are doing that you're seeing to step up better for our colleagues who are neurodivergent or struggle or have disabilities?
I am really happy with what I'm seeing, especially from leaders being willing to just open the conversation. It sounds like such a small thing. Have the conversation. Take 10 minutes at the end of your staff meeting and do a true check-in and say, hey, I want to share how I'm feeling personally. Like, I've had a rough week. It sounds like so counterintuitive to like, oh, sharing my vulnerability makes me more comfortable. But I think it does comfort people to know that they're not alone, and it comforts them to know that their leaders are cognizant and aware of some of the things that people are dealing with right now, especially with the pandemic.
What's surprising is how many people do accept it, and then it's no big deal, and it kind of goes away from being this elephant in the room to something that's just a part of the day-to-day. So I think that's great.
For sure. I mean, I know personally how challenging it can be to be vulnerable, but I would encourage all leaders to just dip your toe in the water of that vulnerability. Like, it doesn't have to be super in-depth, but just being willing to take that first step to be vulnerable and to open the conversation with your employees, I think goes a long way, and the impact of that can't be underestimated.
From your experience, your perspective, what are some ways that we could show up as better allies?
If you want to be an ally to the disability community, if you want to be an ally to people who are neurodivergent, then you need to listen to the people who are actually a part of this community and give them the opportunity to make a choice about what language is most comfortable for them. Don't come in and try to dictate to people in this community how they should be talking about themselves. And if you want to come into the allyship community, I think there's some self-seeking that needs to take place where you question, what are the attitudes that I have and why might I have them? It can really make a difference in how then at that point in time you engage in these conversations.
And what are some ways that we can challenge that confirmation bias that we usually subconsciously seek out in the world?
Think about, what life would be like if those were the shoes that you were actually in. Because I'm here to tell you, like I said, most people are going to encounter or live with a disability at some point in time in their life. I think that my willingness to kind of confront my own internal stuff is sort of a part of a greater life attitude that I have of questioning, why do I think what I think? I never hit a point where I'm like, okay, I'm arrived. Like, I'm always asking myself, so what next? What do I need to learn next? Why do I think what I think? Is there something more I could be doing to learn more about this topic?
I think that's such an interesting approach to self-education as well, because that's kind of a question I've been asking myself lately. Like, where's the finish line for personal development, right? Like, just accepting that there's always going to be stuff I don't know, accepting that I should be questioning what I'm just taking for granted that I think I do know, and that there'll never be an organic finish line. It's just learning a new lesson at some given point in time.
It's that cliche that happiness isn't a destination. And I think the same thing goes for personal development, for growth. Like, I don't believe in this concept of like, oh, like I'm finally mature, I'm who I'm going to be. Like, no, who I am going to be today, I may be happy with that person today, but it's completely normal. And it makes a ton of sense that a year from now, I'm not going to be the same person. And I hope I'm not the same person, because I should be integrating what I learn, what I experience into who I am. I'm always talking about like my various hobbies. Like, I love cars, I like to paint, I photograph, I teach yoga. They're like, oh my gosh, how do you keep it all straight? And I'm like, well, because, to me, those aren't things that you just hit that point where you're like, okay, well, I'm as good a painter as I'm ever going to be. Like, I'm as good at photography as I'm ever going to be. I like being able to shape myself and shape my own personal growth, shape the things that I enjoy, based on experiences that I have. Like, why wouldn't I be interested in all kinds of things other than, stuff that I'm good at, or stuff that I was good at, 10 years ago.
Even if we have the draw and the calling to try something different, and we're drawn to it, we don't necessarily take that plunge, right? Like, I'm thinking of even snowboarding or surfing. I feel like those are activities that we're surrounded by growing up, and maybe anyone like me just takes it for granted and assumes one day I'll learn how to do that. But until I actually force myself to try it, I'm not learning how to do any of it.
Even the work that I'm doing with the ERGs, having uncomfortable conversations. It's like, I'm not the person that is going to volunteer to say, oh, okay, this thing is bugging me. Like, we need to talk about this. Like, I know this about myself, that I'm not great with uncomfortable topics. So being in this role with the ERG has given me an opportunity to learn that about myself and make a decision like, okay, well, do I want to work on this? Every single day, I'm having conversations with people who disagree with me, or, have attitudes about disability that aren't always awesome,
What are some things that you've learned just from having conversations like that, like a better approach that maybe other leaders might benefit from knowing?
I've learned to kind of take my own attitude about something and put it to the side, and be willing to open the conversation with, okay, well, why do you think this? Instead of me coming into the conversation and saying, here's how it is, and this is the right way to engage with this community, or this is the right way to talk about this community. I've learned that it's much more effective to ask questions that will help hopefully lead people to make their own conclusions,
And my final question for you is, what's your favorite way to win Wednesday?
The best way to win Wednesday is to not think of it as the hump day, or the oh, I'm only 2 days out for my weekend. And instead, I think about, who am I on the weekend, and why can't I be that person every day? If I feel like there's a misalignment between who I am outside of work and who I am at work, I want to address that difference and find all of those things that I like about myself that I'm not bringing to work, and start my Wednesday by incorporating those things.